Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our Friday SHFG colloquium. Today we have three panelists who are going to discuss stories from the field, perspectives on cultural resource management and preservation, and we are really pleased to have Jennifer Thornton, Casey DeHaven, and Benjamin Marnell with us today. So this is our first one of these that we've done in a panel format. With all the other colloquium, we have taken questions via the chat. So if you have a question for one of our panelists while they're speaking at any point in the presentation, please go ahead and put it in the chat. And we will answer all the questions at the end of the three presentations, but we can collect them throughout the talk today. So we are really glad to have everyone present today. We do not have another colloquium scheduled, but we do have the SHFG award ceremony is going to be on May 21st. So watch out for an email about that. And then the Trask lecture with Arnita Jones, I think is going to be on June 4th. So we will finalize that schedule and she's going to give the Trask lecture, and that'll kind of be the closing out of our spring colloquium series. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel, and then I'm going to briefly introduce all of our panelists, and then we will let them take it away. So today our panelists are going to examine the intersections between cultural resources management, CRM, the federal government, and history. The management of cultural resources has broad ramifications impacting diverse publics and communities on multiple levels. And it is difficult to overestimate the importance of the federal government to CRM. Federal legislation establishes the basic framework for CRM practice, with technical briefs and publications establishing best practices, regulatory processes helping to maintain professional standards, and the government is also entrusted with the direct stewardship of cultural resources ranging from historic battlefields to presidential tweets. Historians participate in CRM at all levels, and historical research is essential to identifying, evaluating, and interpreting cultural resources. As an inherently interdisciplinary profession, CRM demands historians develop unique skill sets. They must work in applied settings, tackle controversies, interact with the public, and collaborate with subject matter experts, both within and outside of the federal government. So our speakers today are going to discuss challenges of practicing CRM based on their experiences in the field, and we're very excited to hear their talks today. So first up is going to be Dr. Jennifer Thornton, who is a professor in the history department at West Virginia University, where she teaches courses on cultural resources management, historic preservation, and public history. She has, in addition to her training in history, she has a background in ethnography, archaeology, and cultural resource management. As a researcher for the consulting firm LSA Associates, she documented and evaluated diverse historic properties throughout Southern California, including Jewish agricultural sites and cultural landscapes of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians Reservation, and industrial facilities in LA for the Survey LA. She has also conducted ethnographic fieldwork with descendants of Welsh colonists in Patagonia, which sounds incredibly awesome, by the way, and carried out archaeological survey and excavations throughout Mesoamerica and the American Southwest. So we're excited to have Jennifer present today. Next up, Casey DeHaven is currently the administrator of the easement program at the Maryland Historical Trust in the State Preservation Office, where she manages MHT's vast portfolio of historic easement properties, including conducting inspections and site visits, facilitating reviews for proposed changes, and regularly communicating with property owners and representatives while offering technical assistance on preservation techniques and best practices. Before coming to the MHT, Casey was a manager at the easement program with the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Washington, D.C., where she managed a portfolio of historic easement properties nationwide. She has a BA in history and historic preservation from Shepherd and an MA with a certificate in cultural resource management from West Virginia University. And last but not least is Benjamin Marnell, who is currently a master's student in the public history program at West Virginia and working towards a cultural resources management certificate. He got his bachelor's from the University of Pittsburgh, majoring in history and minoring in secondary education. He held an internship at the West Overton Museum in Scottsdale, Pennsylvania, developing curriculum under the Pennsylvania Standards of Education. And he currently works as a graduate assistant at the, and I'm gonna not pronounce this correctly, Monongalia. Am I close?
Monongalia.
Monongalia County Clerk's Office in Morgantown, West Virginia. I apologize to everyone in that county. He also held a virtual Foreign Service student internship in my office, the Office of the Historian. His task there is to conduct research on the Reagan administration and policies enacted regarding Suriname, Jamaica, and Cuba between 1981 and 85. And Benjamin's larger research interests include U.S. foreign policy, government archives, accessibility, and the role of cultural resources management. He is pursuing a thesis on British imperial history in the 19th and 20th centuries, focusing on British planter societies in the Caribbean and Africa, which also sounds very interesting. So thank you all so much. Thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today, and I will let Jennifer take it away. And please, as I said, put any questions in the chat as we go, and we will take questions at the end.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay,
great.
Well, thank you so much for having, for Shafaq for having us and letting us present on this panel after the conference last year was canceled. And thank you for that really warm introduction. So I'm Jennifer Thornton, and I do teach at West Virginia University. And I realized in my bio, I kind of forgot the most pertinent part to this presentation, which is that I used to work for the Forest Service. So that was my federal career experience. And I worked for a number of years for the Forest Service as an archaeologist doing cultural resource management. And now that I'm teaching classes to history students about cultural resource management, I kind of am reflecting on that experience and in a new way. And that's why what my panel or my presentation today is going to be about, is basically me realizing that that more historians needed to be doing the type of work that I did as an archaeologist, and that my colleagues who were all archaeologists was doing, managing cultural resources for land-owning agencies like the Forest Service, like the Park Service, like the Bureau of Land Management. And that's an aspect of cultural resource management that historians typically aren't as involved with. And I'm realizing now that I've sort of shifted my career laterally into history that, we could be doing a much better job of it if historians were more invested and more involved in that type of work. I think throughout the whole panel, we're going to kind of encourage people to push sort of your imagination of what cultural resource management can be. Maybe you actually are doing it, even if you're not defining yourself as a cultural resource manager. And so kind of an effort to think about all the different ways in which federal historians and federal employees can impact cultural resources. So what I'm going to talk about today, first, I'm going to give a very brief definition of cultural resource management, that acronym CRM, which I don't think many people are particularly familiar with. Very briefly say what the role of federal government is. It's actually far more expansive than what I'm talking about, but I will focus on the Section 106 process, which is one of the main drivers for CRM in the US. And then sort of explain how and why archaeologists are dominant in CRM, particularly with the Section 106 process. And then finally end with my plug sort of for action or for change, that, why federal historians should play a more active role, specifically in that Section 106 process in CRM. So what are cultural resources? Well, the National Park Service defines cultural resources as physical evidence or places of past human activities. So you can think of that as like material culture, right? It's sort of sometimes described as the physical traces of past human life. So traditionally, you'll think of things like artifacts, both historic artifacts, prehistoric artifacts, historic sites, archaeological sites. also historic buildings and structures. Over the last several decades, the National Park Service has sort of expanded the definition of cultural resources to encompass traditional cultural places. So places that may be natural places, but are significant not because of what's necessarily physically there, but because of its cultural association. And also cultural landscapes. Most recently, and this is more true internationally, intangible cultural heritage is being defined as a cultural resource. This is more, again, internationally. This is not really been reflected yet in US policy and law, but that's thinking about things like oral traditions, song, traditional crafts, traditional practical practices, rituals, considering those intangible things as cultural resources as well. But like I say, in the US, typically we're more materialistic in our definition of cultural resource. We think of things and places. So cultural resource management, and this is again drawing from the National Park Service, what do cultural resource managers do? Typically, it breaks down to research, planning, and stewardship. So research is typically identifying cultural resources, documenting them, and evaluating their significance, usually by determining whether or not they're eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. This is critical to planning, right? Knowing whether there are significant cultural resources and how they may be impacted by federal actions, hopefully makes for better decision-making, right? And then finally, stewardship, which is probably the most public facing and kind of where the public in general, general public is aware of CRM. That's dealing with the active preservation and interpretation of cultural resources. But cultural resource managers do all three, and we spend actually quite a bit with these first two, and perhaps not as much as we would like to on the third. So in terms of the role of the federal government, it is vast and complex, and there's a number of legal drivers. Like I said, I'm going to focus on one that comes from the National Historic Preservation Act. But if you're interested in some of the other laws and policies, I'm sure we can handle some of those in the Q&A. So the National Historic Preservation Act, which passed in 1966, it did a number of things. So one of the things it did was it set up the National Register of Historic Places. It also created the State Historic Preservation Offices. So every single state has one of those offices, which is called the SHPO. And the SHPOs, they run the preservation sort of programs within their states. So those are some of the things the National Historic Preservation Act did. But it also had a small and mighty section 106 of the law, which requires the federal government to take into account how its actions impact cultural resources that are eligible to the National Register. So only their impact on significant cultural resources, those that are potentially eligible to the National Register of Historic Places. So it's a really small portion of the law. It's really only like a short paragraph, but it has a huge impact. And it has generated the Section 106 review process, this complex bureaucratic regulatory compliance process that I know there's a lot on this slide, so I will summarize how that law, that little paragraph, is put into action. So what the Section 106 review process is first the federal government saying, okay, are we going to do something that could impact cultural resources? And then if the answer is yes, then the next task is to say, okay, well, what are the resources, to identify them, evaluate whether or not they're eligible to the National Register, because remember, the law only applies to those that are eligible. So what that means is if you determine there is a cultural resource, but it's not important, it's not eligible to the National Register, then you essentially write it off, right? You don't have to consider it in the process of your action. You can bulldoze it, you can destroy it, whatever. It is not considered, you don't need to consider it in your planning. So if, however, you determine there are properties, that there are cultural resources that are eligible, then you need to say, okay, are we going to mess them up? Are we going to have a negative impact on these cultural resources? And if the answer is yes, then you make some effort to resolve or mitigate those adverse effects. On the side, you see consultation running the whole way. Ideally, you should be consulting with stakeholders throughout the entire process. So you always consult with the State Historic Preservation Office. Sometimes you consult with other agencies that may be involved in the project alongside you. You often are involved in consultation with public stakeholders. Sometimes those are individuals, sometimes those are organizations, and also often tribes that may be invested in the project. The reason Section 106 is the main driver for cultural resource management, has this process, one of the main drivers for cultural resource management in the United States, is because it has to occur before the project proceeds. So the federal government is not allowed to disperse funds. It's not allowed to start construction. It's not allowed to issue a permit before it has completed this process. So it's not a suggestion. It is a mandate. You have to do this before you proceed. So that's that process. So what has happened is that Section 106 process is absolutely dominated by archaeologists. So just as a snapshot of this, if you do a Google image search like I did of cultural resource management, what will come up are lots of pictures of archaeologists doing archaeological work. You do not see a single historian represented here, right? When I first started teaching cultural resource management, management classes here at West Virginia University, some of my colleagues who are archaeologists, former colleagues at the Forest Service were like, but I thought your job was with the history department. And I had to explain, well, you can teach cultural resource management to historians too, and historians can be involved in the process. And there are historic cultural resources as well that historians have, insight into. But that surprise was due to the fact that CRM has become just absolutely synonymous with archaeology. It's often sometimes called contract archaeology because there's a whole private industry that do contracts with the federal government on these projects as well. So there's historic reasons for this. Really archaeologists were involved in sort of the predecessors of Section 106. So those was often called salvage archaeology at the time. So those began really in the 1930s with WPA projects and the Tennessee Valley Authority projects. There's other legislation that got sort of archaeologists involved in large federal construction projects. One of the really important of these is the 1960 Reservoir Salvage Act. So basically with these projects, you'd have archaeologists come in advance of the bulldozers, identify significant sites, and swoop in and do salvage archaeology to try to extract as much information and also artifacts as possible before a site would be bulldozed or flooded. Right. And so that kind of idea of we want to try to save what we can or mitigate damage, or if we're going to destroy something, at least document it first. That sort of having archaeologists involved in that for decades before the National Historic Preservation Act passed meant that it was really easy for archaeologists to sort of segue into doing Section 106 work and doing cultural resource management work that's related to Section 106 and that sort of process. You don't really see historians involved in this that much. Now, it's not a blanket statement. So for instance, if there is a National Park Service unit that is really geared toward a historic site, say it's a historic battlefield, say it's like a historic fort, they may hire a historian to do their Section 106 process. But almost always who is hired to do the Section 106 process is an archaeologist. That was my experience with the Forest Service. All my colleagues were archaeologists. Every single person I knew on other forests or with the Bureau of Land Management or anybody who was doing the type of work I was doing, I only knew archaeologists who were doing that. So this has a number of impacts, and one of them is there's a lot more jobs for archaeologists to apply for in the federal government. So this was a search I did last year, but I recently went back on USA Jobs, which is the main clearinghouse, right, for federal employment, and the numbers are similar. I think this is representative of sort of what you find. So there's typically a handful of jobs that are being flown specifically for historians, right? And there is also typically a handful of jobs that are being flown under the job description, or you can find with a keyword search for archaeologists, right? And you see that here. But there are a lot of jobs. that for cultural resource managers, if you're searching that keyword search. So here we see there's 154 jobs when I did this search. The same day there were, a couple dozen archaeology jobs and only 5 historian jobs that were being flown that were identified specifically by those terms. And the thing is, though, that probably about 90% of these CRM jobs are really only looking to hire archaeologists. So basically, an archaeologist has way more jobs that they can apply to. If you look at the qualifications for these that are under cultural resource specialist or a manager, you'll see they require archaeological field schools. They usually require a degree in archaeology or closely related field. However, having done the work, I can say with complete sincerity that a historian could do that work, right? In almost all of these cases, a historian would be qualified and competent at that work, but the default is to just hire archaeologists into those positions. I think this has a real impact on how cultural resource management is processed in the Section 106 process. And what I see happening is archaeologists, and any discipline, you bring your professional bias with you to work, right? There are absolutely archaeologists who are really interested in the historic period. There are specifically historic archaeologists, but I would say the majority of archaeologists came to archaeology because they were interested in prehistory. And they bring sort of that bias towards being really interested in prehistoric cultures when they document, record, and assess sites for significance. And remember that site significance is really important because if you determine a site not to be eligible to the National Register, you don't have to consider impacts or mitigate impacts during a project. You literally write it off, right? And so kind of showing this unconscious or perhaps sometimes conscious bias against historic sites. This is a typical cultural history section for taking a snapshot of one from a cultural resource management report. And you can see in this 8-page cultural history, this actually, if you look at the report, was about a paragraph covering the entire historic period for this area, whereas there is about, like 8 pages or so, or 7 or 8 pages on the prehistoric era. And you could say, well, it's a longer period of time, but it's not really reflective of what you find on the ground. The majority of sites I recorded for the Forest Service were historic sites. Oftentimes in most areas, there are at least as many historic sites or cultural resources that are being documented and recorded, or oftentimes more historic than prehistoric. So as an example of the types of cultural resources, historic cultural resources that I was recording and assessing when I worked for the Forest Service in New Mexico, there are things like CCC culverts. This is a Basque sheep herding pen. This is a historic mining cabin. This is a peeled ponderosa pine. So historically, this was done historically, although this may have been done prehistorically as well, but this was done historically by Navajo Native Americans who peeled back the bark of ponderosa pines to harvest the cane bean layer for food. And you can still see the scars on the trees today, and you can date them with tree ring dating. And then this is a historic logging railroad. So what I'm trying to say with this is that despite having been an archaeologist, having many friends who are archaeologists, I like archaeologists, I work with archaeologists, but in my experience, when an archaeologist sees these 2 examples of a cultural resource, these 2 sites, they're both artifact scatters. They actually have a lot in common, right? There's about the same number of artifacts. There's about the same site, density of artifacts. The main difference is the time and culture that produced these artifact scatters, right? But an archaeologist almost always will be more interested in this artifact scatter because this is a prehistoric ceramic scatter, and this is a more recent historic trash scatter that's probably about 70 years old. Right. And as a result, they're far more likely to think that this artifact scatter is significant, and they're far more likely to want to protect it and preserve it if, say, the Forest Service was going to build a road in this area. So this is my final sort of why I think historians need to be involved in this, is because ultimately, I think that the cultural resources in the United States are a type of archive. right? They are primary sources of the history and prehistory of this area, right? And they can provide really important information that's just as important as information that's in more traditional like archives. Right. I think historians bring, and what I wish I had worked with historians, right, when I was doing this work for the Forest Service, is I didn't have any training in archival research, and most archaeologists don't. So historians bring that skill set to the table. They also bring an awareness of historiographical trends and sort of how historians are approaching different time periods, what are seen as the significant research questions for the historic period. Archaeologists tend to read the literature written and produced by other archaeologists and may not be aware of the debates and academic debates going on, that historians are having, right? And that's really important. You have to know that information, that historical context, in order to really determine, is this cultural resource eligible to the National Register? You have to know that sort of current historiographical trends. And then finally, especially as more historians are thinking about material culture, there is an awareness that material culture can really shape our understanding of the past. So not everybody historically was literate, right? Not everybody had the power to create written records. And not everybody's records were preserved and are currently held in archives, right? But every single person has left some material trace of themselves in their lives in some way, even if it's just their bones, right? Even if that's the only trace that's left. So in many ways, the material record, right, that you see on Forest Service land, on Park Service land, and Bureau of Land Management land, that material record is often more complete than the archival record, the traditional archival record. And therefore, I would argue can help us write more complex, more complete, more nuanced histories. But I feel like in order to make sure that material archive, right, of these cultural resources is there for us to use, we need to have historians working alongside archaeologists, making those determinations and helping to research, document, plan, and act as stewards for those resources moving into the future. So that's what I have for today. Like I said, I'm happy to kind of delve into these issues more during the Q&A, and this is my contact information.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's really fascinating. And I'm sure we will get a lot of questions at the end. Casey, are you up next? Do I have my order correct?
Yep. So let me go ahead and pull up mine. Alrighty. Okay, so my name is Casey DeHaven, and I am the administrator of the easement program here at the Maryland Historical Trust, which is the State Historic Preservation Office. And thank you, Jen, so much for that presentation. I think that was an excellent segue into my topic. And so I'm going to get a little bit more pigeonholed here, and I'm going to specifically focus on historic preservation easements. And so kind of as Jen was saying there, it's become, an important kind of connection to be made between historians and preservationists working in the field. And I think working with historic easements has become kind of a threshold of sorts to connect those. And in my time working with preservation easements specifically, not only do we pull from cultural resource management, but we also pull from academia to be able to develop kind of our research on all of these historic resources that we're actively working to preserve every day. And we're drawing on all of the written history and knowledge that we already have recorded, as well as what we're able to physically research and document today. And then moving forward with how to best preserve those and interpret those resources. So just a little bit of background about the Maryland Historical Trust specifically. So our easement program, we currently hold over 750 easements on over 850 properties throughout the state of Maryland. And so between all of these properties, the main goal is to be able to continue to preserve these properties either in perpetuity or by term easements, which I can get into a little bit more later. And so basically the way that I kind of divvied this up today is there are what I have found 4 main criteria to ensuring the successful management of easement properties for any organization or agency that does hold easements. So the number 1 priority that you have there as an easement holding agency is stewardship of those easements. So during and throughout the term of that deed of easement, you want to ensure that those terms are being upheld, not only by your own organization or agency, but by the property owner themselves, just to ensure that the property is being carefully maintained to those specific standards. An easement program, it needs to be established within an agency in order to administer those easements. And so there are specific criteria. So not every agency or organization is going to be qualified to hold easements on historic properties. A lot of that is based on what funding is available for your agency or organization, the continued stewardship and maintenance of these historic resources is not cheap. So you have to be able to maintain a fund that is going to be able to help your agency take care of those resources and monitor them effectively. And within that fund, that also includes being able to have the staff members that are able to come into your agency with that background knowledge in cultural resource management, as well as in, academic historians, being able to bring all of that skill set into your program to effectively monitor and then continue to help preserve these historic properties. And in addition to that, it's also, the primary component of stewardship and successful stewardship of an easement program is building good relationships with your property owners and having regular monitoring conducted at all of your easement properties in particular. So being able to have that in-person contact, which of course over the past year and a half has been very tricky for a lot of easement holding organizations specifically to be able to manage, and the best ways to ensure that the monitoring continues even during a pandemic when face-to-face contact with property owners is not always possible. And so it's definitely something that's been interesting to try to develop new models for instituting successful stewardship of our easement properties. So kind of the next level that we're dealing with here are the transaction side of dealing with easement properties. And so this is more of a process of, developing and executing and then recording the actual deed of preservation or conservation easement on a property. And just to clarify, typically historic preservation easements are dealing with built structures. Whereas, you have conservation easements that typically are dealing with open landscape and green space, battlefield properties, whatever it might be. And even as Jen had kind of mentioned, they're dealing with specifically archaeological properties as well that maybe don't have built structures on the property, but we are protecting archaeological resources and deposits that are within the ground. And so then within an easement, you have to kind of look at the property that you're dealing with. And so each easement holding organization is going to have essentially kind of a blanket easement document that they're going to use for all of their easements and how they're going to draft that easement. But then it's also, you're going to kind of pick and choose specifically in conjunction with the property owner or representative, what specific aspects of that property are going to be protected and how. So each easement, and I can answer questions about, more specifics on how to draft easements, but typically you're looking at each individual resource, whether it be an old schoolhouse or whether it be a plantation home or whether it be a row home in an urban setting or an archaeological site, whatever it might end up being, all of those properties are going to have specific language within their deed of easement that are going to cater to what should be protected on that property and how that will be ensured and how you're going to ensure that within the deed of easement. And then whether or not, based on how the easement property is coming to the agency, if that easement is going to be perpetual in nature or if it's going to be a term easement. And so additionally, on top of kind of drafting these easements and how they're going to be protected and what will be protected, you also want to make sure, and this is one of the #1 goals of any agency that holds easement properties, is ensuring that the restrictions within the easement are not overly restrictive. So you want to make sure that, yes, you're able to ensure legally that this historic resource is protected and preserved perpetually, or at least with a term easement, which typically lasts about 45 years or so, which can be extended as well. But that's the ultimate goal, is to make sure then that not only are you protecting it with the primary goals of ensuring that it is not going to be demolished, it is not going to be dug up, it is not going to be added onto in a way that would adversely affect the historic fabric that remains. And those are always kind of the main goals of all of the easements. But you also want to make sure that, especially if they're private residential properties, which a pretty vast majority of MHT's portfolio is, you want to make sure that those properties are able to be enjoyed and lived in. I had a professor in undergraduate school that always said that the best way to preserve a property is to live in it. And so that's a philosophy that I have carried on into my own career in preservation, and that I continue to use today, especially when implementing these easements and making sure that we're keeping the best interest of this historic resource in mind, and we're ensuring that the property is being preserved appropriately, but also making sure that it's livable, and that you're able to allow families to raise the next generation within those walls, or within that landscape, and just making sure that it's there for generations to come to be able to enjoy as well. And so that's always kind of the delicate balance of drafting easements. All right, and so the next one, which is I kind of touched on in the first slide with stewardship, is the monitoring aspect, which is probably arguably, I'd say the most important aspect here, is actually being able to physically go out and monitor easement properties. So this entails actually being able to be there face to face with the property owner, in a perfect world anyways, and then being able to have photographic documentation on each visit when you're going out to visit these properties. And so not only does this give you a firsthand boots on the ground visual of what this property is looking like, to be able to physically see and make sure that the property owners are, within the terms of the easement, and that they're within compliance. There's nothing funky going on at the property. You're making sure that everything looks good, that they're taking care of the property as they should be. At MHT, we specifically advise all of our property owners based on the Secretary of the Interior standards. And so those are what we use firsthand in all of our decision making, just to ensure that these easement properties are being taken care of to a very specific standard of preservation. And so on top of that, it also helps, especially for government agencies in particular, I have found, to be able to kind of have a face to a name, instead of just being some kind of, we always kind of get criticized as just being government employees there's nothing else there. And it sometimes can make property owners a little testy when they're dealing with legal restrictions on their property and all they ever see is an email. And so being able to physically be there and to meet them face to face, and to ensure them, we're all human here and we all have the best interest of this historic resource in mind. And one of the biggest aspects of easement property owners is that all easements are voluntary on the part of the easement property owner or representative. And so usually it's not met with a lot of defiance, I would say, but it's always helpful to grow those working relationships with your property owners and representatives, to be there in person and to be able to talk through things. And we come to these properties as the experts in preservation and cultural resource management. And so a lot of times these property owners are looking to us to be able to help them through the process of project review, and to help them take the best course of action to continue to preserve their historic home. And then last but not least, which is the more unfortunate aspect, but definitely necessary, is to be able to have an enforcement plan in place when you're an easement holding organization. And so if in fact a property owner or representative is violating the terms of their easement, then you have to be able to kind of have a contingency plan in place for what your next benchmark items will be to address those violations of the easement. And this can be, it can be very minor in nature, issues I would call cyclical maintenance issues, to more major things where, something's demolished or something is added on to something, or a lot of ground disturbance has taken place, or, any sort of action that is taken on the property that is outside, either prohibited outright in the deed of easement itself, or if it is something that the easement will allow only if the owner will come to the easement holding organization first for review and approval before that action is undertaken. And that's always kind of the key goal, especially with having that open communication with your property owners, and to be able to have that project review kind of criteria open and available for them. So that way a property owner knows exactly when to come to you and with what questions, if there is anything that they are unsure if they need to come to us for or not. And so being able to have that open line of communication is always useful and effective for preventing our ability to enforce the easement if at all necessary. And so typically then when we set those benchmarks to address the violations, it starts out kind of on a small level. I mean, there are always things that happen. And so before kind of jumping the gun, all easement holding organizations definitely kind of have those smaller steps, less invasive steps that they take to be able to come to a conclusion and to address the violation, whatever it might be. And then, it can escalate from there where you then have to take legal action. And that is in and of itself another qualification for any easement holding organization, is to be able to also have the funds for either in-house or outside legal counsel, and to be able to have them as staff persons there to enforce this legal action on their easements if need be. And so just for example, I had kind of mentioned earlier that there are specific ways to acquire easement properties. And we can really get into the weeds, but I'll keep it as basic as possible. And so in order for all easement holding organizations, everybody kind of approaches this differently. And so for example, in my previous position with the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where I was one of two managers there of the easement program, the way that the National Trust acquires their easement properties was typically through a gift of real estate or a donation, a private donation. And then adversely here at the Maryland Historical Trust, the largest way that we acquire the majority of our easements now is through our very robust grant program. And as a result, if a property is awarded grant funds, then typically a requirement is that we will then require the conveyance of an easement on that property, which will be a term easement. And it can be extended at the end of its term. But additionally, there are also several other ways that we will acquire easements, and that is also through private donation, such as this house right here, the Weaver Fox House in Carroll County, Maryland. And so this one is one that we acquired through private donation. Then the caveat with private donation properties is then that it will be perpetual in nature. So the easement, so to speak, runs with the land, which is written into the easement, and it will be perpetual, and it will carry on and be grandfathered in from property owner to property owner. This is the Bel Air Armory in Harford County, and this one was acquired through a government transfer. So we have multiple properties that it was a federal or state government transfer of a sale of the property. So basically, the state government will acquire the property. And then through that, they will protect it with an easement, typically then through the state government agency that represents it, which is the Maryland Historical Trust. And then we have the Allegheny County Library in Allegheny County. So this is one, for example, that was acquired through our capital grant program. So through MHT's capital grant program, one of the stipulations then is if you come in for a grant for work to this property, we will then typically require an easement, a term easement on the property. And so then this is just kind of a little portfolio of, some examples of different types of properties. And so Jen had kind of touched on previously the different, types and resources within the field of cultural resource management and what types of properties that we can work with. And so a lot of times, especially when you're working with the National Register of Historic Places, which is usually kind of the most well-known aspect of historic preservation, you're usually dealing with built structures. So for example, this is kind of what you would typically see, the Star Spangled Banner House in Baltimore. But then we also move down along the line. So MHT's portfolio of easement properties, we protect and preserve a vast wealth of historic resources, such as this. This is the Antietam Railroad Station in Washington County. Being here on the Chesapeake Bay, we are fortunate enough to have many other types of resources that you might not necessarily think about needing preservation. But we have the Baltimore Harbor Lighthouse here in Anne Arundel County. So we have easements on, I think, I want to say 13 or 14 lighthouses specifically within the Chesapeake Bay here in Maryland. This is the slave cabin at Sauterley Plantation in St. Mary's County. So it's not necessarily just about, especially when you come in from the academic side of history, where you kind of start to learn from like that top-down series of history. I remember in my time at West Virginia University, we would often talk about the narrative of the top-down way of approaching history in the past. And so, and what that means for these specific types of properties and how they're interpreted from the view of the big house. And then you get out into these dependencies like slave dwellings. And how do you interpret those, and how do you connect those two, and how do you discuss that narrative? And so we have a lot of these types of structures and dependencies and outbuildings that we also protect and preserve under easement in order to ensure, because a lot of times, as Jen also mentioned, it's these types of structures specifically that often are not the ones that you see written about in the history books and within the historiography. And then specifically, physically, a lot of them have disappeared because until recent decades, preservation efforts have only focused on the big house as compared to these other secondary structures. And so it's certainly an important aspect of MHT's easement portfolio to be able to preserve perpetually and document these types of more, less documented structures that have in past decades been rapidly disappearing, that we're trying our best to diversify our portfolio and to make sure that we are doing justice to this narrative to bring a full picture together for the state of Maryland. And then we also have multiple churches, and this ranges from massive Gothic revival structures in Baltimore City to smaller vernacular examples like this St. John's Union Church in Frederick County, Maryland. And again, back to Jen's point about archaeology, a lot of our easements also protect cemeteries and other archaeological deposits where burials might be present, but perhaps a cemetery doesn't necessarily exist where they have headstones or any types of markers. And so a lot of times our easements will protect the landscape surrounding these types of properties in particular. And then others, we have the Castleman River Bridge in Garrett County. Again, just another good example of other secondary type structures that our easement portfolio takes care of. And I think, oh, yep, that was it for me. Thought I had one more slide, but no, that was it.
Thank you, Casey. Now I want to go visit all of these places. This is always the problem with these kinds of panels. I realize I live here, but I realize all the things I never go see. All right, Ben, we will turn it over to you.
All right, let me get my PowerPoint up here real quick. Okay, so I'm doing, cultural resource management, discussing this from more of how to implement cultural resource managers into government archives and getting them more incorporated into the field of U.S. government and relations with the public. Like everyone has said, my name is Benjamin Marnell. I'm a graduate student at West Virginia University. I have acquired my public history master's and cultural resource management certificate. Also working towards getting a geographic information system certificate, GIS. I'm also currently working at the Monongalia County Clerk's Office in the records management office as an archivist and collections agent. So my presentation in my kind of theory is based on looking at cultural resource management in American culture and how we can look at the documents that are being collected in government archives as physical representations of American culture and heritage, the documentary past of our collective identity and how our government's being operated, and how that can help influence further, accountability, accessibility, and give the public a better idea of how their government's being run and operated on their behalf. So like Dr. Thornton has stated, cultural resource management has largely been an archaeological field. I actually have a really funny quote, which I think she'll find hilarious. But essentially what it says, it's from an article written in the 1980s. But the quote goes, CRM is a field dominated by archaeologists. It's like saying there's an energy crisis. It belabors the obvious. And of course, in the 1980s, massive energy crisis. But so that's where it was for the longest time, mainly from like the 1930s up until about the 1960s and 70s. It was seen as something that was mainly cultural sites, physical buildings, structures, archaeological digs, and then of course, preservation, documentation of those sites, and putting them forward to the public. But things kind of started taking a shift, and that's I can see that through a lot of the different acts that were being incorporated, from the early 20th up until the 21st century. The first kind of starting with like the American Antiquities Act of 1906, which granted the president the power to state what is a historic site, what are historic and scientific interest to the public. And that first law provided legal protections in management fields for how we were to look at historic sites, protect them. About 10 years later, 1916, the National Park Service was implemented. And of course, they're the ones who are mostly responsible for overseeing our historic sites. Interesting enough, I'm doing this presentation from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So kind of one of the most well-known historic sites in Pennsylvania in the United States, of course, for the Civil War. So they're mostly responsible for these sites, overseeing them. Of course, interpretation, site interpretation, public relations, they kind of do a whole field of things here. And of course, any other historic site in the United States. They perform many tasks from preservation, protection, interpretation, like I said. So when you look at it in these kind of terms, then in the 1960s, this rising interest of historic preservation began taking off. People wanted more protections for buildings. There was an explosion of building protections, document protection. We have NARA, who began like 1934. They began collecting government government papers and different kinds of federal agency documents and centralizing them for public outreach and public use. In 1966, Historic Preservation Act was implemented, and that kind of gave the protections of historic materials, remains that were significant in American history, architecture, archaeology, and culture. A year later, in 1967, we had the Freedom of Information Act, which started giving people unprecedented access to documents that weren't seen before. So like recently declassified documents, or documents in agency archives that were finally being looked over and being able to be presented. And that was mostly being done through NARA. So they were the ones who were collecting these documents, gathering them, putting them into a repository, and then sorting through them. And that, when that starts to happen, you start wondering like who's responsible for these kind of repositories. And what I found when I was doing a lot of research for this was that was mostly done by two groups: archivists and records managers. And to my surprise, there's a lot of arguments between the two over who's doing what, why, for whom. So I'll try to define a few different kind of aspects of them. So an archivist serves the need of the scholar, the historian, whereas records managers oversee the business side of an archive. They're more interested in promoting profit and ensuring that the archive that they have is contributing to their organization's goals and mission of getting those documents out to the public. So those are like the two different people who are doing our archives. Archivists helping with finding documents, how to interpret them, protecting them, ensuring that the proper archival procedures are being done in order to ensure their safe and well protection, getting them digitized, documented, and put out for the public, and then being placed in a repository for long-term protection. Records managers mostly seeing the documents that they have as a profit margin and ensuring that their organization has them organized, is easily accessible, and is being overseen properly in the long term. As kind of an archivist at Monongalia County Clerk's Office, I see this relationship pretty well. We have a trained archivist who is always cleaning and trying to make our documents look better because for whatever reason, the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people like to smoke around our documents. So we have a lot of yellowed pages that can only be cleaned with certain kind of materials. And that's what our archivist is mostly doing on her day-to-day basis. Whereas our records manager is constantly trying to find new ways of making the process quicker, getting us to have more public, intersection. How can we help people find their documents they're looking for quicker, get them in and out, and ensuring that that's an easy process. So there needs to be, at least in my mind, more ideas of what a cultural resource manager can do for these archives and these kinds of organizations. So a cultural resource manager, you can kind of define them as someone who is more interested in all aspects of record keeping. They do an archivist job and they also do the records manager's job. They're trained, depending on the field, they're trained in order to collect, preserve, maintain, and also to manage their, where they're being collected, who's getting to see them, how often people are being able to, see these documents, interpretation. They're kind of responsible for a whole amalgamation of things. They do a lot. I have a good quote that I found in another kind of source, which is pretty interesting, I think. Let me pull it up here. So a cultural resource manager, it needs to be seen as more not interdisciplinary. The practice can't be limited, shouldn't be limited to any discipline. For example, the mason who does a good job repointing a crumbling historic stone wall is managing a cultural resource. The house husband who organizes his neighborhood to stop demolition of a locally valued bridge, building, or landscape. The retired Marine colonel who researches her family history and archives it. Or the Native American Indian tribe and other indigenous groups who preserve and pass on tribal traditions. So cultural resource managers have a whole host of jobs that they're capable of doing and do on a day-to-day basis. So especially in a government archive where these documents are only preserved document of how our government's operating, who's doing what, who said what, when, where, why. That is literally the only way we're going to know how it's operating. That's not only our culture and heritage. It's wrapped up all in one. So when you look at culture, it's literally defined as anyone's or any society's passed down traditions and ideas of, what is and isn't important to a nation's identity, our collective identity. And heritage is anything that's being passed down from past generations to present. It's our inherited identity, essentially. So during my time working as a research assistant for the Office of the Historian, I kind of got my first experience with what that would mean in the government. So for those of you who don't know, the Office of the Historian produces these large volumes known as the FOOS editions, or the Foreign Relations of the United States government. And I think from the last time I read, there's like 460 volumes that have been created from everything, from me. I started helping with Suriname, Jamaica, and Cuba under the Reagan administration. So hopefully they can use those kinds of reports that I made to create a volume that documents the decision-making process of the U.S. president, documents from his hand down to his subordinates and what is fueling his decision-making. That's kind of our inherited culture. That's our identity. What Reagan was implementing is passed down to us today, even, and our relations with those countries that he was dealing with are still ongoing to this day. So like heritage is defined, that's our inherited identity of what's occurring. So those have to be protected. And when you have like an archivist or culture or a records manager, you're kind of missing the middle lining, which is a cultural resource manager who can not only find those more documents to help with that, which is what I was doing, was going online to what archives were available to me, documenting what's available, to what extent those are available, and then trying to form a history around what was there, and then presenting that to the public in a way that is accessible and shows that our government is, you can see how the government's being run. These are all things that our cultural resource manager does on a day-to-day basis. So what would hinder their job, though? So like I said before, NARA and different kind of government agencies are responsible for collecting their agency's documents. So NARA collects all of the federal government's documents. The State Department has its own archive. FBI has theirs. CIA has theirs. Office of the President has his or hers. And of course, then that trickles down to presidential libraries. The CIA has what's known as their online reading room. There's archives called Documents Declassified, which is documents from any branch of the government being put into one place. But that can cause a lot of issues, especially in our current day digitization era. What's currently happening is there's a push from the head of government to digitize these records and get them open to the public faster. So a lot of what's occurring is, instead of going through a cultural resource manager and having those documents put through a process of very strict, time-consuming regulations in ensuring that all paper clips are removed or everything is in the order that it should be, so you're not getting big sources of documents all kind of gobbled up into one whole box. You're getting third-party sources like a Google who can come in and scan everything very quickly, but they're not trained in the proper handling and procedures of preserving those documents. I had an interview with someone who works at an archive currently. Try to find that archive name. Yeah, she worked for the presidential libraries of George Bush and the Clinton Library. And a lot of the times she was presented with the possibility of having Google come in. However, what happened was they were scanning a lot of documents through, and these paper clips were still in there because they didn't go through to collect them, and it was tearing documents or destroying them. So that can literally hinder our kind of preservation of these documents. So we're losing that in in a need to keep preserving. So they're doing it with the right mentality, but they're losing out at the end. It's a kind of a win-loss kind of scenario. Seeing I'm kind of coming up on my time here, so I'll kind of conclude here. There needs to be growing accessibility to our archives. That's no doubt. I think anyone who deals with research and government archives understands that. But you need to have more experienced and more trained individuals or cultural resource managers who know the archival principles as well as the records manager perspective of how to get these documents collected quickly and get them preserved adequately, and then, you know, out to the public in a way that everyone has a chance to see them, view them, and see how everything is working. So that's it for me. I'm open to questions.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks to all of you for excellent presentations. We are getting a few questions in the chat, so give me 1 second. I'm going to try to start reading them off. So our first question is from Michael. And hi, Michael. He asked, are archival records documenting environmental impacts of human activity? Would these be considered cultural resources, natural resources, or both? So that's really kind of an interesting thing to think about. So.
Okay, I can answer from the, it's a complex question. So
it's a very complex question.
Yeah. One of the other comments in the chat was from, I think it was from Craig Summers, who mentioned that they worked with the Cultural Landscapes program, and that's what first came to mind. Not necessarily from an archive. Well, let me back up. So let me just say, in terms of like cultural, like human impact on landscape, on natural resources, that's sort of getting to where we're pushing what more recently what gets defined as a cultural resource. So where that comes together, I think best is with cultural landscapes. So the National Park Service first started recognizing those and putting out policy briefs about how you can record these, how you think about these, like in the 80s. So it's been around for a little while now, and now it's becoming really dominant in how cultural resource managers are trying to think about, think from more of a landscape perspective. So that includes things like deforestation. It includes things like, changes to watersheds. It includes things like terracing and agriculture. So yes, that's being recorded. There's a few other government programs. Actually, one of the earliest ones in the 30s, which is another like New Deal era program, was the Historic American Buildings program, where they had architects, Aldeburgh architects went around recording, making beautiful architectural drawings of historic buildings. That program's still around and it's expanded, and the most recent addition to it is the Historic American Landscapes. So you actually have people going around recording landscapes that again have natural elements and historic elements, and recording those, and those are kept in the National Archives. So, and it's a tricky thing because it's sort of this culture nature divide, and it's a tricky thing to some Westerners divide those things. Theoretically, we see those things as very different. Other cultures don't, and oftentimes historic preservationists, historians, and archaeologists feel kind of like, we're not biologists. How do we record this stuff? So it brings in, you need to bring in more people. Again, more disciplines to document that. You really need ecologists and wildlife biologists, and you need to bring those people in to kind of look at those questions. I think the other side to that is human, which I kind of am thinking of also the impact of things like climate change, right, on cultural resources, and documenting those and how do we respond to that. And that's something that's an ongoing challenge that preservationists are talking about, but are grappling with. I think especially for places like Maryland, coastal places with a lot of coastline. I don't know if other people have thoughts on Michael's question.
Yeah, sorry, Jen, I thought I was still on mute. But no, I mean, it's interesting that you bring that point up too, specifically about I mean, not just Maryland, but any place that is dealing with these coastal issues in particular. And so that's been an ongoing discussion that I've had in many circles within CRM here, especially as of late. And even more recently, just in the past couple of weeks at MHT specifically, we have several easement properties that are already well-established easement properties, but they are situated close to a coastline of some sort, whether it be oceanside, bayside, whatever it might be. And an issue has come up. I mean, there are a lot of issues with erosion in particular that have come up. And then there are other work items that need to be taken care of. And so in those instances, typically, it happens to kind of be with outside of the easement boundary. And so we're bringing in our Section 106 specialists to determine areas of adverse effect, to determine on their end what the next best plan of action is to be able to stabilize the coastlines in order to protect not just the environmental impact itself, but as well as the environmental resources and ecological resources that are present, but then also the historic structure and what is protected within that landscape by the easement. And so it's all of us having to work together. And with Section 106, we're bringing in our archaeologists. We're bringing in archaeologists who are with other, sister agencies here that we have within the state of Maryland. And then it's pulling in a lot of areas of expertise. And we're looking at specifically our library here at MHT. We have a library full of a lot of documentation. I'm not going to call it an archive. It's not really an archive per se. It's just our library contains a lot of historic reports and findings that we have, whether they be historic in nature, whether by historic, I mean like they're reports that were done in the 70s or 80s or even the 60s. And so being able to go back and have our librarian do that research and kind of put together a narrative description of the history of this specific property to piece together what the next best plan of action is to properly stabilize not only the ecological environment of that property, but also the historic resources on that property. So it's pulling in a lot of disciplines and working interdisciplinary between city officials and government officials and a lot of preservation specialists. And so it's certainly something that we have been taking great pains to make sure that we're having documented appropriately.
Yeah. And if the question is specifically what those like the actual physical records, the reports, I would classify those as cultural resources. And if you think about it, that is a record that we're currently creating. It's a physical trace we're leaving behind. And it's something that tells the history. If it's a report document, the report itself is a cultural resource. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, I remuted myself. That is really interesting. Alex, I see your raised hand, so I'm going to unmute you and let you talk in 1 second, but I want to read your comment first. And Ben, I think this is related to some of what you were saying about record managers and archivists. So Alex wrote, at NARA, records managers and archivists are the same people. So I think this is different in a lot of organizations, and I think you were talking very specifically about records managers where you are. But Alex wrote, agency records managers ensure records schedules agreed to by NARA are being followed, and is accessioning archivists at NARA ensure the newly accessioned records follow box lists provided by the records managers. So I think it's functioning a little differently within NARA. But Alex, hold on 1 second. I'm going to try to unmute you so I can let you make your comment. There we go. Hi. Thank you for joining. I assume you work at NARA.
I do. I'm a legislative archivist at NARA. So I was really interested to hear what the panel was about, especially as it pertains to archives as a cultural resource. Mm-hmm. As a reference archivist, I provide archival resources to researchers every day that I believe are, definitely an indelible part of our nation's story. I really appreciated the overall idea that in addition to, sites and material culture, the actual, archives themselves should be considered a material resource, not just for the content that provide, but for the archives themselves as objects, putting a volume or documents in front of someone is an experience just as much as, digitizing something in and providing it to that way to people is. That said, I do want to push back a little on the idea that digitization is destroying documents, and that it is, I guess, not seen as necessarily a more functional part of the preservation process. One of my duties is actually digitization in-house at NARA. So NARA does partner with third parties, including Google Books, Ancestry, and Fold3, which provide government documents to the public free of charge at like local libraries and academic libraries, as well as other databases like Praxis and LexisNexis and ProQuest. But all of these people are trained in-house and overseen by archivists at NARA. So people aren't necessarily coming in and taking documents and, using their own equipment on that end. So in addition to third parties, NARA does have a large digitization department on their own that's currently being staffed in preparation for ERA 2.0, which is the Electronic Records Act. In 2 years or so, all records accessioned into NARA will be digital. So we're not going to be taking in any more paper records. So that said, I am all about digitization. I think that the less these records are handled, the more they can be furnished to the public in that way. And to think of digitization as just another step in the processing and preservation life cycle is important, regardless of, the many problems that are going to crop up with digitization, including format obsolescence and the fact that, the software and the hardware that these are stored on may not be here in 10 years or so. That's something that we're dealing with, even with, things like floppy disks and CDs and things that degenerate in a matter of 10 years, whereas paper is something that lasts for millennia. In this day and age, especially with the resources that are available to people in terms of travel and the restrictions of COVID and other practical considerations, I really think digitization is the way to go.
Yeah, as someone who makes spruce, I'm with you 100%. I think if we have things digitized, it's going to make things more accessible for so many people, and it's going to be a really, really good thing to do. I think we just have to make sure we do it the right way. And I know NARA is trying incredibly hard to make sure they do that the right way. I've used the Reagan emails, which are, from a 1980s program, and there's no division in the emails. They just all run together as one giant block of text. It's quite a thing to look at. So yeah, I think if we can get things digitized, because like Alex was saying, the formats change and you can't get stuff off computers anymore. So how are we going to make sure all this is preserved? So it is really important.
I think one thing interesting about that from like the more sort of Section 106 process is it really wasn't until I started teaching them like, oh yeah, like records are cultural, like of course they are, right? And I think it was because my mind was so in that what can be listed on the National Register, right? And objects, like paper archives can't. And so they aren't covered under Section 106. But that doesn't mean they're not cultural resources, and it doesn't mean that we aren't managing them, right? And so it's sort of pushing people who work in those more traditional Section 106 sort of aspects to think about, to broaden our minds too about sort of what other resources are out there that we're producing, that we're using. So I really appreciated your comment. Thank you, Alex.
For sure. And even just the idea that the material culture of the records themselves should be studied as a material resource, I think is an interesting field of study.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it, these documents are kind of the only things we have which are going to speak about, decision-making process and who's making these decisions and why and how. And especially for government, that's very important to transparency and kind of moving forward with how we see our government and it's working. I did want to comment though, I wasn't directly speaking to NARA doing that because obviously NARA's the government agency, preserving a lot of these documents. But I have seen in a few instances, especially from the kind of like the current standards that are taking place and what I've read, there are a lot of government agencies that in an effort to meet the urge of digitization and getting that out quickly and much at a faster rate, that third-party places like Google, who have large scanners, they're bringing them in at a kind of a, not to say that they don't want to do things properly, but it's sometimes easier to bring in those kind of third parties to do it a little bit quicker. That's not to say that everyone's doing that, but in a few instances, I'm seeing that is taking place. I know in our office, we have one of those Google scanners, but we were trained on how to use it. So we take the time to, of course, take out staples and everything. But I don't know, I was trying to say there's more of a danger, I guess, lurking, that this is something that could be, happening if we're trying to push digitization a little bit quicker. Obviously, to meet the demands of this new era, and everything is computerized. Do we sacrifice efficiency for speed? How do we have that conversation essentially? But yeah, I just wanted to clear the air. I wasn't attacking NARA.
No.
Definitely not doing that. So I just
Please feel free to attack NARA. We're a public agency and we live to be attacked. So please send all of your complaints directly to AOTIS.
Listen, here's where I'm going to plug my plug that NARA has the issues that it has because it's underfunded. Write your congressman, tell them to give NARA more money every day because they need it. They need more archivists. They need more. Yep. If they don't have the money, this is why we have a FOIA backlog. This is why we have an MDR. This is why we have all the issues that we have. So I say that any chance I get. So I will say it again. We have one more comment from Michael and Ben. This is kind of related to your classifying, declassifying thing. And Michael works in the Air Force declassification office. And he says there's been no discernible change in government classification policy. What Benjamin might have been misinterpreting is the government's effort to properly classify records that were improperly declassified by unique parties who did not own the information or equities in the documents in those records and should not have declassified them in the first place. So that is why sometimes things get reclassified, which we have run into at Fruce in the office a few times. It is utterly frustrating, but it does happen. So if a presidential library or an agency doesn't have all the equity, but they somehow make this decision, release all of this information into the world, but then someone in DOD or the CIA or state or NSC is like, nope, then they try to bring it back, but it's kind of out there. So it's quite a pickle of a situation at that point because it's been out there, but then they bring it back. So
right. What I was kind of commenting on is when that happens, what's the kind of conversation we need to have to discuss that and to look at that? Because once, like you said, once it's out there, anyone can kind of get that. So did I kind of look at it as maybe a bigger problem than it should have been? Possibly. But that's still something that needs to be discussed when we're looking at government agencies and government archives and the documents that are being put out to the public. Because in the public eye, when you reclassify something that it can cause suspicion. So how do we handle that as cultural resource managers? How do we handle that as those who are responsible for those archives and those documents? That's kind of what I was trying to propose, I guess, a little bit more than saying God, they're doing this on purpose. We shouldn't be doing this. Yeah. But it's something that when you look at it from a public perspective, which I'm a public historian, so I kind of try to look at things a little bit more from how would the person who doesn't know the inner workings of these agencies, how would they view that? And then how can we communicate better to them? And I think that, that's where I was coming from with that. So good comment, Michael. Thank you.
I think Michael had one other comment early on when I was presenting.
Oh, he did. Yes, a very interesting point.
Yes. So it was whether maybe government agencies are preferring to hire archaeologists over historians to do that sort of Section 106 work because they're more likely to kind of tell that agency what they want to do. Like, yeah, go ahead, you can bulldoze this, which is an interesting question. Very cynical. I'm not sure if I'm totally on board with it. I'm not going to say it's totally. I've never seen evidence of that intentionally being done. So in my experience, so like basing it again on my personal experience with the Forest Service, originally right after in the 70s, they hired one cultural resource manager for the entire forest, which was like millions of acres. So it was one archaeologist for the whole forest. And this one archaeologist was way overwhelmed, right? And they were just figuring out what the Section 106 process was. And that person could not be on the ground everywhere. And people, the district rangers were essentially not doing the process. They weren't letting the archaeologists know when they had a project, when they were building a road. So this is back in the 70s. And they messed up a lot of sites, right? So they destroyed a lot of cultural resources that were important. They were sued, quite appropriately sued. The Forest Service lost the case. And as a penalty, they had to hire a lot more cultural resource managers to have more people on the ground. And so the archaeologists went out and hired more archaeologists, right? And so that's kind of been the experience I've seen, is that these archaeologists are hiring more archaeologists, or hiring more archaeologists. So I think it's more of that. And then there's also a sense that archaeologists can handle the historic stuff, but historians can't handle the prehistoric stuff. It's kind of the sense that we can recognize cans, but historians can't recognize like stone flakes. But the truth of the matter is as is true of most government employees, pretty soon you're just in the office and like maybe the contractors are doing the work. So why can't a historian be the person, if that sense, it's like that field expertise is not as critical. So the other thing is, why not have historians and archaeologists, which is what I would like to see, work together? So if our historian can't recognize they can go out in the field with the archaeologist, right? And the archaeologist can identify the prehistoric site. So that's what I would like to see, is not replacing archaeologists with historians, but have them working together to bring that perspective. However, just to get back to the sort of maybe more doing what you want, absolutely 100%. Is this process politicized, or can it be politicized, or can it be influenced by? Of course, absolutely. Especially for high profile projects like Dakota Pipeline, right? If there's a project that's really high profile, if there's a project that involves millions of dollars, cultural resource managers, absolutely every decision you make, everything you say is highly scrutinized. And absolutely that can affect the outlet. So I'm not going to say 100% no. I'm sort of leaning towards, I'm not quite that cynical. I wouldn't put it outside of the realm of possibility. But certainly, sometimes I would say this process, like all regulatory processes, are seen as getting in the way of getting stuff done. Right. So there's always pressure to get someone just to rubber stamp and say yes. Right.
Yeah. Michael, I see you have your hand up. I'm gonna attempt to unmute you. Or I clicked you. I think there you are. Hi. Thanks for joining us today.
So, case study.
Oh, I'm excited about this.
Yes. Before I was a government person, I was a consultant, and I was working on a BRAC situation for an Air Force base. And I was hired to do the assessment of Cold War resources on the base. And I identified 12 significant properties. Mm-hmm. And that was really way too many for the prime contractor. And they said, can you lower that number?
Serious.
No, these are 12 and they're all significant. Well, are these the best examples on the East Coast?
Yeah.
We're not doing a programmatic agreement. You're just asking me what's significant.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to go with 2. You want your name on the report or not? And I said, take my name off.
Yeah. So
and there was another project I was supposed to work on, but no, I got dropped from that. So there's an example.
In your example, was it an archaeologist who was the one who was pushing it down to 2? I'm curious.
No, it was an environmental firm.
It's an environmental firm. Okay. Yeah, that's horrifying. That's awful. Well, and I will say probably an archaeologist would be like, Cold War, it's not that old, and would I'm not saying all, some absolutely would see that. But if you have, like, if you hired somebody who was not a historical archaeologist, who didn't understand the significance of Cold War resources, you need someone who's familiar with the resource to be evaluating it, right?
I can give an example in that case, not one that I worked on, but a Navy facility, perhaps the most important Navy facilities on the shore.
Yeah.
And an archaeological firm was hired to assess the importance. And they said, well, most of this is classified, but we really don't see that any more information would reveal something important. So we're going to say ineligible. And it was completely eradicated with no documentation.
Yeah. So as you can see,
Yeah.
it's problematic, right? And I think that's why you need folks who, it's difficult. And there, I do have review processes, right? That's why the SHPOs are involved, and they can be great watchdogs. But at the end of the day, the law just says you have to consider impacts, and you can consider them and say, we're doing it anyways. But you can see how there's totally room to politicize any of these things, right? And particularly when you start getting into private consulting. You know, private consulting companies are hired often by, you know, the company that wants to do work, right? Who's the private entity that's doing a project, right? And so if it's an oil and gas company, or for instance, that's leasing, has leases on federal land, then they hire a private consulting company to say what's eligible. Of course, there's pressure to say, no, you can go ahead and do your project. And
well, I would observe that as far as the Department of Defense is concerned, they're very good at protecting the stuff that was there before they arrived. As far as the stuff that they themselves have constructed, they see it as obsolete and not significant anymore.
That's an excellent example. And I will say, I do know some folks who've worked on military bases in this capacity, and that's been their experience as well. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right, especially just writing off anything that they themselves did. Not wanting to save, you know, World War II Quonset huts or any of that stuff. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for joining us. So I mean, what I'm taking away from this, and I don't know if everyone else is how do we, as we like to say, bridge this divide?
Yeah.
So we have archaeologists, we have historians, we have cultural resources managers, but also cultural resources, artifacts, archives, all of the things we've been talking about. So how do we make all of this work together better? I mean, do we just need to start having more of these discussions, obviously, but especially from the federal angle, like, is there a way to get the left hand talking to the right hand more? I guess my big question.
Yeah. I would say from my perspective, when working, like, for instance, with the Park Service, of folks who's had, I don't have experience working with the Park Service, but some of the students I have had here, like, have, you know, and they oftentimes the interpretive shop. So like the people who typically come in with a historical background are interpretive rangers, right? And they're interpreting the battlefield to the public, but maybe the CRM person is an archaeologist. And so having those sort of silos in terms of being housed in different shops, I think helps sort of prevents those sorts of conversations. I think, like I said, opening up CRM jobs to historians, I think that's the big thing. It's like, it's too big for any one discipline or any one specialty to be able to do it all. You know, you can't do it all. You can't be an expert on paleo, you know, paleo sites and, you know, Cold War sites and archives and, you know, so it needs to find structural ways to incentivize conversations and collaborations, which I know is hard. I don't know if that's a concrete plan, but I think conversations are
that would also provide some jobs for all these historians who are out there searching for work, who, you know, would probably really fit these roles really, really well and have that skill set, but just can't get in because it doesn't say it on the job description. So.
And then I think also kind of tying in with the stuff, the other work that's going on, like sometimes I think within these land owning agencies, particularly, you sort of think of cultural resource management only as Section 106 or the NEPA process, which is a similar process, and aren't thinking about how do we connect with like the work that Casey's doing, or like how do we think about our records, you know, so I think the broader we push the definition and the more people you bring in as stakeholders, the better, you know? I don't know if Casey or Ben have any thoughts on the big problem question.
Well, I think it's like when you look at like the Fruce editions, for example, that are coming out of the State Department, like at a fundamental level, that's conducting cultural resource management in the field. Because those are physical representations of our collective heritage, like what our government's doing. So like at the basic level, that's cultural resource management, because you're taking the resources that we have and producing an interpretation of those that are being presented to the public. So it's like every level. You have your preservation and collecting, your interpretation, and then your presentation, essentially. So if we look at it from those kind of perspectives and we start trying to, implement that more into the government agencies, you can kind of bring in the historian who knows how to interpret documents. You can, train them to do archives and how to handle documents. Most historians would rather just do the interpretation part, but you can start bringing in people from different fields and get like this collection occurring. So if a cultural resource manager knows how to do all of those things, they can, collect, preserve, interpret, and present. And I think when we start kind of having that discussion more, you'll see more cultural resource managers coming out of the woodwork, more historians wanting to join these archives and do, Fruce and try to work alongside the archivist or the records manager and have those kind of relationships occurring more and more. But it's just, that brings on another whole discussion of, does every agency have to produce some kind of interpretation of their archive, or are they just going to do the preservation and then digitizing and putting it online for people to see? Then where's the historian in that? What would be their role? So it's definitely an ongoing discussion. It's something that needs to kind of occur more and more to see how we can implement these different disciplines. But like I said before, cultural resource managers kind of have a lot of that in their training to begin with. Even like the public historian, things that I was trained to do, as a historian and a cultural resource manager, it's kind of, I've trained to do that. So I understand, how to do the whole process that I laid out. But it's a conversation that needs to happen, but it's a difficult conversation to have when you have all these different disciplines who want to get that job. Who's best fit for it, essentially.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Or any last comments from our panelists? Or any big thoughts? I have certainly learned a lot about CRM and how we need to work better to bridge these divides and make sure we're all communicating and talking to each other and really trying to work together. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, we all want the really important things to get preserved, and making sure that happens is what's most important. And being able to present the history to the public is the whole point. So I think if we can work to make that happen, then we're doing better.
Yeah.
Any last thoughts from our panelists?
The only other thing I was thinking was Ben was talking is the role for generalists as well as specialists, right? And to have generalists work with specialists in the federal government, is the other thing. But a role for both.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yep. I would agree with all of this. Yeah. Well, and knowing that, the archives are important and doing their parts, but they can only do so much. Then as historians, we have to help them and interpret and use the archives. So, well, thank you all for joining us on a Friday. What is a pretty Friday afternoon. So I hope everyone can go get outside and enjoy the rest of their Friday. But thank you to Jennifer, to Casey, and to Benjamin. Thanks to everyone for attending and for some wonderful comments. And we will get this online as soon as we can. And thanks so much for coming today.